All right, Trabosai, good evening. Gesundheit Zimmer. I hope everybody had a meaningful and uplifting Tisha B'Av. Great schos, right? It feels like a special energy when you get to learn Torah again after Tisha B'Av, after being deprived. First of all, I'll say, Chevra, feel free to move forward. This is not like. I know everybody enjoys me straining my vocal cords, but please feel free. So again, thank our Talmud Torah sponsor, Max and Brenda Lapkovsky, in honor of the Bar Mitzvah upcoming Bar Mitzvah Yitzchak Meir, Dr. Riva Mitzner, commemoration of the yarzheit of her father, Larry Schneck, Aryeh Ben Chaim, and our week of learning sponsors, Aaron and Alana Weinberg, in honor of their daughter's Bas Mitzvah, Adina Hinda. We hope that on the merit of our Talmud Torah, we shall all continue to see beautiful nachas from our children, all of the Neshama Shtav and Aliyah, and the families Einacham. And Abosai, with that, let us begin. So today's daf is Yud Aleph. So we're going to pick up in Meretz Hashem from Nun Amud Beis. We left off with Amar Rav Tachlifa Baravimi Amar Shmuel, which is 2, 4, 6, 8, 9. Thank you. 9 lines up from the bottom. So we'll say really an incredible sugya. So Amar Rav Tachlifa Baravimi Amar Shmuel. Hayoshin Bikila Arum. So we'll remember again in yesterday's daf seems like such a long time ago. But in reality, again, a little bit more than 24 hours ago. So we were speaking about the idea of sleeping underneath a canopy. So we spoke about different types of canopies, right? A 2-pronged canopy, a 4-pronged canopy. So once we began the discussion, the Gemara over here transitions a little bit to something a little bit different. Let's say somebody sleeps naked in a kilo. So a person's sleeping under a canopy. Now we'll say, what does he want to do? He wants to say Shema. What's the problem? Is a person can't say Shema in a situation when it's libo roa es ha'erva. Right? You have to be able, the erva, that one's nakedness has to be covered in order to be able to say Shema. So I have a great chap, person has a great chap, what does he do? Motzi rosha chutz lekila v'kari Shema. So Shmuel says, no problem, just stick your head out of the canopy. Keep your body inside of the canopy, stick your head out of the canopy. And therefore what? Essentially, my head is in a different quote-unquote rishus, not technical rishus like rishus, but it's in a different domain. It's in a different place than the rest of my body. So they say, the Gemara, so both say this is Shmuel's Eitzah. Shmuel's Eitzah is, because a kila, both say what we really defined in yesterday's daf, is that the kila is really a self-contained area. So because of that, halacha l'maisa again, if you were to stick your head out of it and to recite Shema, technically, that should be okay. May say the Gemara is a kasha. Hayoshem mikila arum lo yotzi rosha chutz lekila. If one is sleeping unclothed, one should not extend his head outside of the canopy. Bikar kriyashma. So we'll say a brayso that contradicts this. The brayso clearly indicates that halacha l'maisa, sticking your head out of the kila is not going to work. So the Gemara tachama askinon b'shegavoa asara. I will say, what's the case? The case over here, ultimately, again, is when the kila is gavoa asara. If the kila is gavoa asara, then what? Then it's a rishus bifnei atzmo, like we spoke about before. If it's pachos me asara, then it's not a rishus bifnei atzmo. Hachanai mistabra. I will say this seems to be clear. Why? The Gemara says Diktani Seifa halamazadoma. To what could this be compared? La'omed bebayis arum. So ultimately, again, it could be compared to one who is standing inside of a house unclothed. Shelo yotzi rosho chutz l'cholon vikar kriyashma. Supposed to listen to this. Let's say one is standing inside their home unclothed. One wants to say Shema. So I have a great chap. What am I going to do? I'll stick my head out the window. Does that work? No. Why not? Because since I'm standing in a substantive structure, essentially my head is pulled after my body. Right? The majority of my body is inside the bayis. Sticking my head out the window is halachically insignificant. It's ki'ilu, my head is inside the home as well. So interesting, but here's the distinction the Gemara is making. The Gemara is saying this: if you have a kila that is lamala miyud, or let's work backwards. If you have a kila that's lamata miyud, less than 10 tfachim, essentially, the way we view it, like a blanket. So we'll say, what's the halacha of a person's unclothed and they throw a blanket around themselves? They cover themselves up until the neck. Can you say Shema? Absolutely. So a kila less than 10 tfachim ultimately again is like a blanket. A kila more than 10 tfachim, that's like a bias. And I both say again, what's the halacha? If you're unclothed and you stick your head outside of the bias in order to say Shema, it's insignificant. Why? Because since you're standing in a substantive structure, your positioning is determined by where the majority of your body is. And since the majority of your body is inside of the home, even though you're sticking your head out of the window, halacha l'maisa, you're all considered to be, your entire body is considered to be in the home, and therefore you can't go ahead and recite Shema. Shema mina. So again, what the Gemara is suggesting over here is something really fascinating. A kila less than yud is like a blanket. Again, this is for Kriyat Shema purposes, not necessarily for Sukkah. A kila lamala miyud will be like a bias, and therefore, Abosai, wherever the majority of your body is, the entire body is considered to be there. So if the majority of my body is underneath a kila, that's lamala miyud, then even if my head is somewhere else, my head is pulled after my body. Top of Yud Aleph. Ubayis, nami afa pishin gavoa. Both say a home is different. Interestingly enough, a bayis, even if the home is less than 10 tfachim, kevan dikavia ohelahu delagara mikinofos. So ultimately, again, a home is kavua. Because a home is kavua, Rabbosai, it doesn't need to have the requisite shear of 10 tfachim of height in order to go ahead and, so to speak, not act as a blanket. So this is very interesting. So in the Gemara suggesting is as follows. In the kila, in the canopy, if it's lamala miyud, it's like a bayis. If it's lamata miyud, it's like a blanket. A home, because it is fixed, because it is kavua, even if it's not lamala miyud, it's considered to be a fixed structure. And therefore what? If a person was unclothed inside of a bayis, that's the lamata miyud, and they stuck their head outside of the window, they would still not be permitted to recite Kriyat Shema because the entire body is considered to be wherever the majority of the body, is situated. Lishna Achrina, another possibility is Amri Le Amar Rav Yehuda Shmuel Mutar Lisha Mekilas Chasana B'Sukkah. You're permitted to sleep what the Gemara calls a bridal canopy. So if you look at Rashi says Kilas Chasanim Eina Kishar Kila Ve'in Osela Gag V'hi Sevivos Hamita V'Gaga Mushpa Kishal Maklitin. So I will say, so interestingly enough, a bridal canopy would have 4 poles. But what makes it different is that it doesn't have a roof. Remember what we saw in yesterday's daf. What's the halachic definition of a roof? 1 tefach. So this, interestingly enough, this bridal canopy is a little bit of a cross between different things. On one end it has 4 poles, but it comes to a peak, a tip, right? Without any tefach, without any roof. So therefore, Rabbi Yehuda said, name of Shmuel, you're permitted to sleep underneath a kilas chasanim in a chuppah. Why? Because you're not sleeping underneath another roof. So as long as you're not sleeping underneath another roof, you could be yotzei sukkah with that. Levi she'en lagag, afapi shagavoa asara. Interesting. Even if it is 10 tefachim high, halacha l'maisa, as long as it doesn't have a tefach gag, you could sleep underneath it in the sukkah. Says the Gemara, meisvei hayashin bekila b'sukkah. No, yatzidei chavaso. There's a Raisa that says that if a person sleeps underneath a canopy in a sukkah, he's not yotzei. He's not yotzei. Hacham asking, what's the case? Bishiyesh lagag. That's talking about a case where the kila has a roof. We'll say again a very simple halachic roof, which is just 1 tefach of area. Tashma, naklitin shnayim, vikinofos arba. We'll say naklitin refers to a canopy bed that has only 2 poles, right? 1 at the head, 1 at the feet. Kinofos is a canopy bed with 4 poles. Pires agabi kinofos psula. So if you spread a canopy over kinofos, a 4-pole canopy bed, and you sleep underneath that, you are not yotzei sukkah. Agabi naklitin, but if you spread out the canopy over naklitin, kshira, that's the 2-pole canopy. Why? Because there's no gag there. As long as what? As long as the naklitin are not more than 10 tefachim tall off the base of the bed. So the Gemara says, psula. What can you infer from here? That if the naklitin were more than 10 tefachim high, it would invalidate your sukkah experience. Even though what? It has no roof. To which the Gemara says, shani naklitin dikavi. Naklitin are different. I will say why? Because they're kavua. Because they're established, they have like a shem ohel, even if they don't have a gag, which is a tefach. But if it's really fixed in place, then it should be like the kinofos, which is the 4-pole canopy bed. The gabi kinofos lo kavi. When compared to kinofos, ultimately again, it's not so established. The gabi kilo kavi, but compared to a kilo, it's going to go ahead and be established. Okay, Tara Shrab about Afuna, Mutter Lishon Bikila. One is permitted to sleep underneath a canopy. Afa Pishi Yesh Lagag. Afa Pisha Gavo Asara. We'll say dramatic. So Rabbi Bar Rav Huna says that Allah Chalamais, you can sleep underneath a canopy. And even if the canopy is Lamala Miyud, and even if the canopy has a roof, that's a tefach, you could still sleep there and be Yotzi Sukkah. How could that be? Kiman Rabbi Huda. This is referred to the Rabbi Huda. What's the Rabbi Huda hold? Listen to this. Da'amar, Lo Asi Ohel Arai, Umevatel Ohel Keva. Because Rabbi say ultimately again, Rabbi Huda holds that Allah Chalamais and Ohel Arai cannot be Mevatel and Ohel Keva. Rabbi said this is fascinating. So remember again, we have this incredible dialectic by Sukkah. That on one hand, right, when Chazal, we'll get to this Gemara, but when Chazal speak about Sukkah, they say, Tsei midiras keva, vidar bidiras arai. Sukkah is called diras arai. Yet, the diras arai, the temporary structure of Sukkah, has to have certain keva qualities. Certainly, we've seen this already a number of different times. Rabbi Huda holds like this. If you have it, so Rabbi say, think about it just a moment. You have your sukkah, you have your canopy bed. Both technically are an ohel. So Rabbi Yehuda says that when you look at the sukkah is an ohel keva, is a fixed tent or a fixed structure vis-a-vis the canopy bed. And therefore Rabbi Yehuda says something amazing. He says, Lo asi ohel arai. The ohel arai ultimately again is not mevatel the ohel keva. Is not mevatel. Ultimately, again, is not mevatel, the fixed structure, ultimately, again, of the Beis HaMikdash. So this is fascinating. So even though Sukkah is called Diras Arai, at the end of the day, legabe, the canopy bed, the Sukkah is called the Diras Keva. So therefore, again, what Rabbi Yehuda essentially says is like this. If you're sitting in your Sukkah, and then you're sleeping underneath the canopy bed, he says something amazing. He says the temporary tent, which is the canopy bed, is essentially subsumed by the more permanent tent, which is the sukkah. So the Gemara says, "This nan Rabbi Yehuda no again hayino lishan tachas hamita b'fnei hazakenim." Because Rabbi Yehuda said we used to sleep underneath the bed all the time in front of the zakenim, and ultimately again the Gemara b'fnei hazakenim, and no one said anything to us. So the fact that no one said anything to us indicated that it's not a problem. I b'leim halach Rabbi Yehuda. So we'll say. So the Gemara asks, why doesn't Rabbi Bar Rav Huna just say the halacha follows Rabbi Yehuda, right? What did Rabbi Rav Huna say? He said, mutar lishan bikila. You're permitted to sleep underneath a canopy, even though the canopy is 10 tefachim high and has a roof that is a tefach. Why don't you just say the halacha follows Rabbi Yehuda? Correct? Because Rabbi said, what's the svara? Why does Rabbi Rav Huna say you can sleep underneath the canopy bed in the sukkah? Because lo asi ohel arai umevatel ohel keva. So just say the halacha follows Rabbi Yehuda. To which the Gemara says something interesting. Amar halacha Rabbi Yehuda. Because if the Gemara would have just said halacha follows Rabbi Yehuda, hava amina hani mili mita delagabo asuya. I would have thought, when does the halacha follow Rabbi Yehuda? Only when it comes to a bed, right? Rabbi Yehuda holds the halacha lamaisa. You could sleep. Remember, because Rabbi Yehuda say we used to sleep underneath our beds. We would sleep underneath the beds, and the zakenim never said anything to us. We'll say, what's the logic? Because Rabbi Yehuda would say the bed is an ohel arai, a temporary ohel. The sukkah is an ohel keva, and the ohel arai is not mevatel, the ohel keva. So if the Gemara would have just said halacha follows Rabbi Yehuda, I would have thought it's dafka did in beds. Why? Mita de la gaba asuya. Because we'll say a mita ultimately again is primarily made for what? Primarily made for what? To sleep on it. To sleep on it. So maybe if you use it in an unusual way, like by sleeping under it, that's when that's not going to go ahead and obviate the mitzvah of sukkah. Avakila de la socha asuya. But a canopy, which is dafka made to be used on the inside, emalo, I might have thought that Allah Lamaisa, that type of ohel, can go ahead and be mevatel the sukkah. Kamash malono, kamash on time Rabbi Yehuda, the lo asi ohel arai, mevatel ohel keva. Therefore, the Gemara teaches us that Rabbi Yehuda's svara is that an ohel arai, a temporary tent, whatever the temporary tent is, a canopy underneath the bed, ultimately again that is subsumed by the sukkah, and ultimately again lo shnamita for lo shnakila. There's a beautiful hashkafa contained in these words as well. That lo asi ohel arai umevatel ohel keva. The ohel arai refers to our bate kinesios, refers to our shuls. The ohel keva is the Beis HaMikdash, right? Isn't this incredible that this is today's daf? And I will say sometimes, we are so privileged to live in a time where we build such beautiful shuls. I'm referring to physical structures as well, but that's not really what I'm referring to. We built such beautiful kehilos. We built such beautiful energy. We have to always be careful that the beauty of the temporary structures we build do not diminish our yearning and our wanting for the ohel keva of the Beis Hamikdash. Always sometimes in life, the b'diavad becomes the lechatchila. Right? The b'diavad is what we have now in the absence of a Beis Hamikdash. Sometimes the b'diavad becomes so good that you forget that it's a b'diavad. It looks like a lechatchila. So the Gemara tells us, Chazal tells us, on Masei Tisha B'Av, lo asi ohel keva o mevatel ohel aray. Make sure the ohel keva of the kehilos, the bate kinesios you build, as wonderful as they are, never let them diminish the yearning, the pining, the wanting for the ohel keva of the Beis Hamikdash sheibanim hira b'yameinu. Let's begin the Mishnah. Keva Mishnah. Hida las agafen v'esad las. We'll say, here we go. We're talking now about the psula mechuber. So what am I doing over here? I'm taking a vine. So remember, gefen is a grapevine. It's a grapevine. I take a vine. Dalas, gourds apparently grow on vines also. So I take a gourd vine. Or kisum. Kisum is ivy. So these are all vine items. So I take a vine. B'sichecha gaba. Everybody say, what am I doing? I'm taking the vine and I'm pulling it over the sukkah. Pulling it over the sukkah. So what's the halacha? Psula. Psula. Everybody say, why is it possible? B'pashtos mechuber. We're going to talk about this again. Remember that halacha l'maisa schach cannot be mechuber. Schach cannot be mechuber. V'im hayas sichuch harbe mehen. But if you had a lot more kosher schach than these vines, oshe katzitzan, or you detach the vines from the ground, kshera. Ultimately, again, you could use them for schach. So in other words, there's nothing you could use vines for schach. The problem over here is that the vines are attached. That's when you can't use them for schach. Ze'aklal. This is the rule. Kol shu mekabel tumah ve'gidulam ena'arez. Anything that's mekabel tumah and doesn't grow from the ground, ein misachach bo. Ultimately, again, you are not allowed to use for schach. V'chol davar she'ein mekabel tumah u'gidulam ena'arez. So I will say anything that is not mekabel tumah and grows from the ground, misachach bo. I will say this becomes a very important klal. What are you allowed to use for schach has to satisfy two criteria. It's not mekabel tumah, which I will say usually comes to eliminate what? Kalim, excellent. Excellent. Kalim, right? Excellent. Kalim, and ultimately, again, gidulam in haaretz, it grows from the earth, which we'll see what that eliminates as well. Good. So let's analyze. Yosef, Rav Yosef, Kamed Rav Huna, V'Yosef V'Ka'amar, O Shekatzitsan Kshera. So we'll say Rav Yosef was sitting before Rav Huna, and he was giving over this teaching about using these vines to go ahead and for schach, and he said, O Shekatzitsan. If you cut them, if you detach them from the ground, then ultimately, again, it's kosher for schach. Comes along Rav, V'Amar Rav, Tzarich L'Na'neya. Ooh. Rav says, 1 second, because I both say, remember, what's the imagery over here? I've got a sukkah, we'll call it 3 walls, right? What am I doing? Right? I have ivy growing in my property. So what do? I just take the ivy and I lay it on top of the schach. What's the status of the ivy? Right? It's puzzle. Why? Mechuber, it's attached. Okay, so comes along Rav Yosef and says, of course, so you have to just cut it, you have to cut the ivy, you have to detach it from the ground sometime before the Yom Tov of Sukkot. And again, I will say, according to Rav Yosef, in front of Rav Huna, once you detach the ivy, or a grapevine, whatever you're using, halacha, once you detach it, then what? You're good to go. To which Rav comes along and says, no. Even after you detach it, tzarich l'na'neya. You have to, we'll call it lift up or move around the schach a little bit, the now detached vines, in order to go ahead and make it usable for sukkah. Amar le Rav Huna, Shmuel Amra. So Rav Huna said, Shmuel said that. It wasn't Rav. Or I should say, he said, Shmuel said, tzarich l'na'neya, that you have to move it around. So the Gemara says, Shmuel Amra, Ajin Rav Yosef lape. Rav Yosef turned around in a little bit of anger and he said, Amar le, atu mi ka'amina lecha delo Amar Shmuel. Did I say that Shmuel didn't say it? I was just saying, Amar Rav, Amar Shmuel. Rav and Shmuel both said it. Amar le, to which he said back, Amar le Rav Huna, Haki kamina lecha. No, Rav Huna says, Rav Yosef, you're not understanding me. He said, Haki kamina lecha. The Shmuel Amra below Rav. No, I'm telling you, you're wrong. You're quoting tzarich l'na'neya, that you have to move around the schach in the name of Rav. Rav didn't say that. It was Shmuel who said it, and in fact, again, Rav actually holds you don't have to. Below Rav, the Rav achshuri machshir, because Rav holds that once you detach the attached vines, You're good to go. You're good to go, even if without moving the schach. Both say, where do we get this from? The Rav Achshuri Machshir. Both say, listen to this, because Rav holds that halacha l'maisa, even without moving the schach, ultimately, again, the sukkah is going to be kosher. Right? Look at Rashi, Achshuri Machshir, right across in Rashi. Beloni does not hold you have to move the schach at all. The kasavar ketzitzasa zohi gemar asyasa. Well, so remember that phrase. Ketzitzasa zohi gemar asyasa, which means what? Detachment is the final step in schach preparation. You don't have to go ahead and start moving stuff around. Rather, all you need to do, halacha l'maisa, is to go ahead and detach it, and then you are good to go. So the Gemara says, the Gemara is talking about, the Gemara is, Kihad Rav Amram Chasida. Listen to this case. Just like Rav Amram Chasida. What did Rav Amram Chasida do? This is fascinating. Rama techelta leparzuma di inshe beisei. He was putting tcheles on his wife's cloak. The Rebbe say, why was he putting tcheles on his wife's cloak? Look at Rashi. Leparzuma di inish beisei, letalis ishto, di kasavar lailas man sitzisu, uriisem also pratlak susuma. Avaksus laila chayiv. Because listen to this. Rav Amram Chasida held that tzitzis was not a mitzvahs asay shazman grama. Wasn't a time out commandment. Well, if it's not a time out commandment, then what? Then we're in our chayavos. So he's putting tcheles on his wife's garment. Good. So the Gemara says, "V'lo pasik reishei chutin," and we'll say he did something very interesting. So what he did was, if you could imagine, tzitzis is made from 4 strings that are folded and then tied. So we'll say, if you can imagine the following, imagine taking one long, very, very, very long string and going ahead and looping it, and then tying the knots. But what you have on the bottom is, the bottoms are all attached. So he tied all of the knots in the tzitzis, but the strings themselves were not yet detached. Am I clear? Right. So in other words, the knots were fine, but like when you took out the bottom of the tzitzis, you didn't have 8 independent strings. You had 2 loops, or 4 loops, I should say. So what happened? So the Gemara says, "V'lo pasuk reishei chutin." V'lo pasuk reishei asli kamei Rav Chia bar Avshi. Here for Rav Chia bar Avshi. Amar le hachi amar Rav mifaskon v'hen ksherin. So Rav said, no problem. Just cut the strings at the bottom. Just cut. They both say, here's what's interesting. What happens when you cut the strings at the bottom? What happens? Essentially, you kind of have almost like pre-made tzitzis. You see, when we think about making tzitzis, kind of like making schach, you go through a process. You take the strings, you loop them through, you tie the knots, and by the time you finish tying the knots, tada, the tzitzis are done. In this case over here, what Rav Amram Chasida was doing was, he tied all the knots, but the tzitzis were not yet independent strings. The tzitzis only became independent strings after the knots were already tied. And yet Rav held that once you go ahead and snip the bottom of the strings, thereby detaching or establishing the strings as independent tzitzis, the tzitzis are kosher. What do you see from here? Alma psikasan zohi asiyasan. So you see from here that Rav holds that detachment represents creation. I can come up with a better formulation than that. But ultimately, again, psikasan, the detachment of something, ultimately, again, represents its final creation. So just like by hachanami, so to be here by schach, kitzitzasa nami asas. The Gemara assumes that just like Rav allows you to go ahead and only cut apart the strings at the end once the tzitzis are already made, psikasan zoi asiyason, so too by schach. Once you go ahead and you have the attached vines on the sukkah already, once you snip those vines and go ahead and detach them from the ground, what happens? Your sukkah instantaneously becomes kosher. Even though Rabbi say, remember again, you're not going through the normative process that we would have thought. The normative process is you build walls, and what do you put on top of walls? Schach. What kind of schach? Schach kosher. Right? It's not the pshat that you go ahead and you create a puzzle entity and then do something extraneous to the structure to go ahead and make it kosher. But yet Rav holds that Allah Chalamaysa that works. V'savar Shmuel, and you telling me that Shmuel does not subscribe to this idea? Listen to this case. Hitil Schneck Schneck b'vasachos v'achar kach pasak roshei chutin shalahen ksherim. Here the boss listen to Shmuel said as follows. Both say, what happens if you take 2 corners of a garment, and it's this case, And what happens? I take strings, and I loop through two corners simultaneously. So both say, so again, if you can imagine, you take two corners of the garment, you take one long string, fold it over multiple times, and you go ahead and you put it through the holes on two corners simultaneously. And then only afterwards, you detach the bottoms of the strings, making them independent strings. Ksherin! Shmuel says it's kosher. So apparently Shmuel subscribes to the idea of psikasan zohi asiyasan as well. My love, shekosher, v'achar kach posek. Both say, are we not talking about a case where you're first tying the strings and then detaching them at the bottom? Lo sheposek v'achar kach kosher. No. What's the case? The case Shabbos say is that you first detached the strings and then you went ahead and you knotted them. Posek v'achar kach kosher. My lememra. I don't understand. If you detach the strings before you tied them, what's the shaila? To which we're not supposed to listen to this Ma'od, because what would you have thought? Ma'od Tema, Amud Beis, Ba'inon Knaf B'Shas Psil V'Leka. We'll say, I might have thought like this. I might have thought, we'll say, that maybe the halacha of tzitzis is you're only allowed to work on one corner at a time. So you both say, what I'm doing over here is actually not such a big chiddush. What are you doing over here? If you can imagine, you take two corners of the garment, and imagine just going in and taking the string and looping it through both corners simultaneously. And then what am I going to do after? I'm not knotting. What am I going to do after I put it through the holes on both corners? What am I going to do? What do I do? I cut it in the middle. So I haven't knotted anything. So the Gemara says, what's the chiddush? The chiddush is like this. I might have thought that the halachos of tzitzis demands that you only work on one corner at a time. Kamash malo no. Kamash halacha you could work on two corners simultaneously. But to be clear, Shmuel is not condoning a knotting of the strings and only later, subsequently, separating the individual strings. So once again, we have a machlokes Rav and Shmuel, a dramatic machlokes. Psikasan, zohi, asiyasan. Do we say that detaching something in a way that makes the item kosher validates the entity? And so far, again, this comes up in two distinct areas. Number one is going to be with schach. If I put schach puzzle on top of my sukkah as mechuber, and then once it's on the sukkah, I detach it from where it grows. Is that going to be enough? And tzitzis, same case similar case by I knot the entire tzitzis, but the strings are still attached at the bottom. I snip them after everything is already done. Rav says kosher, psikasan, zohi, asiyasan. Shmuel says puzzle. If you made tzitzis and you did not separate the bottom strings, psulin, ultimately again it's puzzle. Ma'ila psul niolam. Does that mean they're puzzle forever? V'tiyuf to the Rav, and it refutes Rav. Rav, my psulin, no, what does psulin mean? Psulin ad sheyifseku. Psulin means it's puzzle until you go ahead and you detach it. U'shmuel amar psul niolam. Shmuel says no. When it says puzzle, it means puzzle forever. So we'll say, listen to this, it's very important. According to Shmuel, if you made tzitzis in this interesting way, Rabbi, right? Imagine you took one very long string and you doubled it over multiple times, you folded it multiple times, and you go ahead and you put it through the corner of your garment, and you make all of the knots, but now you have essentially 4 loops on the bottom of your tzitzis. So what do you need to do? Cut each loop, make it into 8 strings. Shmuel would say those tzitzis are puzzle. There's only one way to remedy them, which is how? Untie the whole thing and retie it. There is no way to remedy those tzitzis according to Shmuel because he rejects psikasan zohi asiyasan. Rav would say, as soon as you go out and you snip the bottoms, making the 4 loops into 8 strings, you are good to go. So the Gemara says, V'chein amar Levi, psul liolam. Levi agrees with Shmuel. V'chein amar Rav Masna amar Shmuel, psulun liolam. Ikidar, Rabbi say, so there's an alternate version of this. Ikidar, amar Rav Masna, b'didi hava uvda. Rav Masna said, this happened to me. And what happened? And I came in front of Shmuel. Apparently, again, he made tzitzis like this. We're taking a string that was doubled over multiple times, put it through, knotted the whole thing, and now he's left with 4 loops at the bottom. And he just wants to go ahead and cut each loop, making it into 2 strings, making it into 8 strings of tzitzis. And Shmuel said to me, I came to Shmuel, Shmuel said, no good. If you went ahead and you knotted your tzitzis and only afterwards detached the loop strings, psulin, ultimately again the tzitzis are pasar. So once again, when we say psulin, what does that mean? The only way to remedy the tzitzis is how? go back, untie it, retie it. V'od tanya gabi sukkah. Oh, back to sukkah, Rabbi say. What about by sukkah? Tasa v'lo mina asui. Wow, Rabbi say. So now we come to the real essence of it. The Torah says, Chag hasukos tasa lecha, which tells us that a sukkah is something that you have to construct in an orderly fashion. But it can't be tasa v'lo mina asui. Mina asui means, Rabbi say, means you can't create an invalid sukkah and then perform an act extraneous to the sukkah in order to make the sukkah a kosher entity. That's what it means. A sukkah must be constructed in a proper sequence, but if the sukkah was constructed in a way that makes it possible, performing an act extraneous to the structure will not validate the sukkah. What's a good example of that? That's this case. I put vines on top of the sukkah as schach. What's the status of my sukkah? What's the status of my sukkah? Puzzle. So now what am I going to do? I'm going to detach the vines from the ground. I've done something extraneous to the structure. That's called taseh v'lo mina asui. It is puzzle. So the Gemara says, Mikan amru, from here we say, Hidla les hagafen v'esadlasas hakisum v'sichich al gavan psula. Based on this, we say that if you went and you placed grapevines, gourd vines, ivy vines on top of your sukkah, it's puzzle. So the Gemara says, Hey Chidami, what's the case? Ilim and Bishalo kids, it's on. If we're talking about a case where you didn't go ahead and detach the vines, my iriya mishum tasavalomana asui, teifuk leid the michubarninhu. We'll say if the vines are still attached to the ground, the problem is not one of tasavalomana asui. The problem is what? Mechubar. Elo b'shekatzatzan. Rather, it must be where you detach the vines. And yet, despite that, vikatani psula. Yet it still says that the sukkah is pasul. Ushmamina. The lo amrinon kitzitzasan zohi asiyasan. And what do you see from here? That we do not say kitzitzasan zohi asiyasan. V'tiyufta de Rav. And this is a refutation of Rav. Amr lecha Rav. Rav will say, no. What's the case? Hachamay askinan de shalfinu shalufe de lo minkara asiyadido. Rav will say, it's actually very interesting. Rav will say, what's the case? The case over here is when you went ahead and you pulled the vines out of the ground, they're detached, but they're not detached in a recognizable way. So because they're not detached in a recognizable way, people are going to see the sukkah, and they're going to assume that what's the status of the vines? What's the status? They're attached. And people will automatically assume that the sukkah is kosher, and if we allow you to use that sukkah, and people may come to erroneously assume that a sukkah that is made with mechubar is going to be kosher. Miko makom, tlon v'achar kach pasak, kashya l'rav. I would say, nevertheless, the case of tlon v'achar kach pasak, where you put it on after you detach it, is still a kasha to Rav. Kasha. Indeed, this is a question on Rav. Lema ketanai. We'll say maybe this whole thing is a. So we'll say, so just to point out what we have over here, because this is really incredibly dramatic. Machlokes Rav and Shmuel. The machlokes centers on one phrase: psikasan zohi asiyasan. That's what it comes down to. Psikasan zohi asiyasan. If you take something that is made in an invalid way, and then you quote unquote do an additional act, halacha l'maisa, does that additional act essentially kasher the entire process or not? Rav says yes, Shmuel says no. The machlokes manifests itself in two distinct cases. Case number one is sukkah. You put schach that was mechuber onto the sukkah, and ultimately again you went ahead and you subsequently detached it. Rav will say, good, psikazin zasiyasan. Shmuel says, no, it's pasul tasev lo mena asui. Similarly by tzitzis, you made the whole tzitzis with folded over string. Now you not the entire thing. You have to cut the bottoms. Rav says, no problem, cut the bottoms. Ultimately, again, it's kosher. Shmuel says, pasul. But I'll just point out, but I know this is a machlokes, and it's a machlokes, a real metzias in life. So we'll say, the shaila is, does the process matter or do the results matter? That's the machlokes Rav and Shmuel. Right? Shmuel says the process is irrelevant. What matters are the results. Do you have a kasher sukkah? Do you have sukkah with detached schach? The answer is yes. Good enough. Right? Tzitzis. Do you go ahead and do you have 8 strings? You do? Great, fantastic. I don't care about the process. I just care about the results. Rav says, chas v'shalom. Life is all about the process. Right? The results are only meaningful if you followed the correct process. And we'll say we're going to see who we paskin like, not just in sukkah and not just in tzitzis, but in life as well. But it's a very yesodistic machlokes. Do we care about just results, psikas siyasan, or do we care about process as well? So machlokes tanoim, Aver v'liktan pasal. What's an interesting case? We're seeing a lot of things tonight. The hadas, the myrtle branch. So we're going to discuss in Yitzchak Hashem on Daf Lamed Beis that if the myrtle branch sprouts berries, if your hadassim sprout berries, if there are more berries than leaves, the hadas is pasal. But you do have the ability to go ahead and remove the berries from the hadas. So the Gemara says, Avar v'liktan pasal. If you went ahead and you remove the berries, ultimately again from the hadassim, ultimately again it's going to be pasal. It's going to be pasal. Divrei Rabbi Shimon. Divrei Rabbi Shimon ben Bar Yotzad. The Chachamim say ultimately again that it will be kosher. What's the root of the machlokes? Savruha. So we assumed that what's at the root of this machlokes? Techuli ama lulav tzarich eged. But we're going to get to all these sugis, which are quite exciting. Lulav tzarich eged. Both sides. Do you have to bind the lulav together? In other words, does the lulav, hadassim, and aravos all have to be taken together? So that's lulav tzarich eged. So everybody agrees that the lulav and the hadassim and the aravos have to all be taken together. V'alfinon lulav misukah. And we learn out lulav from Succah. Tichsiv gabi Succah tasev lo min ha'asui. So listen to this. This is incredible. We learn out Succah from lulav. I should say lulav from Succah. Shabbos say, now watch this case. Listen to this. Imagine for a moment you have your bundle, right? So you have your lulav, your hadassim, your aravos. They're all tied together. And your hadassim sprout berries. Too many berries. So what are you going to do? You're going to start plucking off berries. And let's say you pluck off enough berries to make the hadas kosher. But what's the problem? When you made the aguda, when you made the bundle, you made a bundle with a pasal hadas. So the shaila now is, after you've already made the bundle, if you remove the berries, thereby making the hadas kosher, does that retroactively make the igud good or not? So the Gemara says, "Ma'ila v'hakameflagi." So they must be arguing about the following point: Demand machshir, the one who holds that it's kosher, savar amrinon gabi sukkah kitzisasan zu asiyasan, the gabi lulav nami amrinon likitasan zoe asiyasan. So we assume that the same opinion will allow you to put schach mechuber on the sukkah, and then afterwards detach the schach, who says psikasan zu asiyasan, will also say that if you pick the berries off the hadas, once the hadas is already in the bundle, that's going to be kosher as well. Uman de pasal, but the one who says that it's pasal savar lo aminan gabi sukkah kitzisasan zu asiyasan. He will hold that we don't hold by sukkah that detaching the already present schach is going to make the sukkah kosher. V'gabi lulav nami lo aminan likitasan zu asiyasan. By lulav also he will not say that the picking off of the berries once the hadas is already in the bundle will allow the bundle to be kosher. To which the Gemara says, "Lo, dechuli amalo aminan gabi sukkah kitzisasan zu asiyasan." In reality, everyone is going to agree. But when we say everyone, I mean everyone but Rav is going to agree that if you put schach mechuber on your sukkah, simply detaching that schach is not enough to make the sukkah kosher. V'hacha, so what's the machlokes over here? V'hacha, the melaf lulav misukkah kameflagi. Wow. But here the machlokes is, do we learn out lulav from sukkah? Man de machshir, the one who holds that if you go out and you remove the berries from the hadas once it's in the igud, it's kosher. Sabar lo yalfina lulav misukkah. He holds that we do not learn out lulav from sukkah, so that even though tasev lo min ha'asui is not good by sukkah, it will be good by lulav. Uman de pasal, the one who holds that it's pasal, sabar yalfina lulav misukkah. He'll say we do learn out lulav from sukkah. The other possibility we'll say is isvirlan de lulav tzarich eged. If you hold that a lulav has to be bound, everyone agrees that we'll learn out the halachos of lulav from sukkah, which means what? That just as the sukkah, we don't say psikasan zui asiyasan, so too with the hadas pasal, picking off the berries once the hadas is already in the eged, is already in the bundle, is not going to be machshir the hadas. Here's the machlokes. Bless you. Mar savar tzarech eged, or mar savar ein tzarech eged. I will say a much more fundamental machlokes. Do the dalid minim need to be bound or not? I will say we're going to get to this sugya. Do the dalid minim need to be bound or not? So the Gemara says, "Uplugta dahani tanoi," and their machlokes is another machlokes time. This sanya, here we go. Lulav bein agud bein she'eno agud kosher. A lulav, whether you bound to it the other species, that dasim and the aravos is kosher. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, all good kosher. First, why Rabbi Yehuda says if you bound them all together, it's kosher. She'eno all good puzzle. But ultimately, again, if you don't bind it together, it is possible. My time is Rabbi Yehuda. I will say, where does Rabbi Yehuda get this from? That the lulav, the hadassim, and the aravos have to be bound together. Yalif lekicha me'agudas ezov. Fascinating. He learns out the binding of the four species, really the three species, the lulav, hadassim, and aravos, from the agudas ezov. So what's the agudas ezov? It's the bundle that's used to sprinkle the para aduma. So the Gemara says, ksiv hasam, ulekachtem agudas ezov. It says over there, you shall go and you shall take the agudas ezov. Uksiv hacha ulekachtem lachem b'yom harishon. It says lekachtem by both, right? Lekachtem by agudas ezov, by paraduma, and it says lekachtem b'yom harishon by lulav. Ma lahalan ba'aguda, just like by paraduma, you take the ezov, you take the shnitolas, the piece of red wool, you take all the different pieces and you put them in a bundle. Afkanami ba'aguda. So too by lulav, you have to take the lulav, the adasim, the aravos, and put them in a bundle as well. But Rabbanon will say, Lekicha mi lekicha lo yafinon. Rabbanon don't subscribe to that Gzeir Shabbat. Kiman azla hadisanya. But say, whose opinion is reflected in the following idea? Lulav mitzvah la'ogdo. It is a mitzvah to go ahead and make an igud, make a bundle from your lulav. Beim lo agdo kasher. But if you did not make a bundle with the lulav hadasim and aravas, ultimately again it's still kasher. Whose opinion does that reflect? Rabbi Yehuda. So the Gemara says, if you want to say it's like Rabbi Yehuda, kilo agda my kasher. Rabbi Yehuda holds that the lulav requires eged. It requires binding. So if he didn't do it, then why would it be kasher? Rabbanon, and if it's the Rabbanon, on my mitzvah, according to the Rabbanon, lulav doesn't require igud at all. So why would you even say mitzvah? The Rabbanon he. Rabbi said, listen to this. Even the Rabbanon who hold that Allah lamaisa lulav eno tzarich eged, that lulav does not have to be bound together, agree that what? If you do it, it's nice. If you do it, it's a mitzvah. Why is it a mitzvah? Umishum shene'amar ze keli va'anvehu hisno'eh lefanav b'mitzvos. Because Rabbi say the pasuk says, "This is my God, and I will exalt him." The concept of hidur mitzvah. Even the Rabbanan, ultimately, again, who don't hold that you have to put the lulav in a bundle, will agree that doing so is the performance of a mitzvah lechatchila, because at the end of the day, you're beautifying the mitzvah. Rabbi say, how do we paskin in the machlokes Rav and Shmuel? So ultimately, again, we paskin like Shmuel. So therefore, again, Rabbi say, if you were to construct a sukkah with mechuber, and what? And then detach, you put vines as your schach, and then you detached the vines, what would be the halacha? You would need tzarich l'na'aneya. You would have to lift up the schach. You have to move it. So I'll tell you where this comes up. This comes up often, and people sometimes don't realize this. You build your sukkah, and then you realize, maisim b'chol sukkis. You realize that what? What do you realize? There's a tree on top of your sukkah, and the tree is provides more shade than sun. So now you realize you have to go ahead and remove some of the limbs, some of the branches of the tree. So you hire a guy, because we're Jewish, right? You hire a guy, right? He comes in, he cuts down the limbs of the tree, and now what happens? So now you have, Baruch Hashem, no tree on top of your sukkah. What's the problem? The problem is also you have to go back and lift up your schach again. Now remember, I have to point out, you don't have to lift up all of the schach. You just have to lift up some of the schach. You have to do some type of maisa with the schach. Because why? Because think about this. Otherwise, if you don't do anything, it's a violation of Tasa v'lo min ha'asui. It's psikasan zohi asiyasan, which we reject. Essentially, we'll say we paskin like Shmuel, namely, we'll say that it is not just the results that are important. You must maintain fidelity and allegiance to the process. And I will say that's the halacha by sukkah. It's the halacha by tzitzis. Right, so if you were to do this interesting idea of looping the things together, making it just like that, and the bottom strings are all attached, and then you snip them afterwards, that would be possible. You have to untie everything. Because I will say in life, it's not just the results that matter. The process is incredibly important as well. All right, we'll stop over here for tonight. Shkoyach, everyone. Shkoyach. All right, Chevron Zoom. Shkoyach, everyone.